You're good to go.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much to the BC chapter for giving me this opportunity to speak today. It's my absolute pleasure to share some of my work and even more than that, to solicit some feedback from this audience. So thank you. My opening premise is that history matters. And I think most people already know that. We respect the expertise of people who have a long experience with the landscape, and we value all sorts of things from the past. In fact, we keep them, right? We keep them in our homes, in museums, offices, other places all over the place. We have things that are historical. And people who are involved in conservation research, management, and planning on rangelands, that includes scientists, ranchers, regulators, and so forth, also all already rely on historical knowledge, on knowledge of the past in various ways. But here's the problem. Range science and etc. does not have formal methods for assessing and incorporating historical information in its many archival forms that it comes to us. Now, when I said people already rely on history, I'll give you some examples of historical thinking. These are visualizations, both by ecologists, Dig Foster and Don Gayton, that they show historical trends, right? Change over time trends in the things that those ecologists are interested in this case, forest cover and various wildlife species, pardon me. These are great, and they give me inspiration for thinking about the potential to create visualizations like this that can become useful tools for thinking through management questions. But I want to emphasize both of these are impressionist. They are by ecologists who have spent a lot of time looking at historical materials and then have sort of put these together, but there's no data set behind these exactly. They're impressionist in that sense. There are fewer examples of studies that actually do sort of stake these visualizations to empirical research. And here's an example of one that kind of did that. This is Ted Lee's work trying to develop historical baselines for, this is the Kelowna region, right? What they did in this project is took a very robust collection of air photos that the province has from 1938 and compared them to modern imagery from 2001 and kind of coded for aspect, elevation, things like that, and then backstreamed it to create a historical baseline of this region in 1800. And I just want to emphasize, like, baselines and backstreaming, these things that are that we work with regularly, these are historical concepts. And so there's potential to do things like this and really work with real historical materials to help create those and think about them. Okay. This, I want to say though, this is incredible, right? Ted Lee's work is incredible, but this used one type of document, air photos, from a very well-preserved digitized collection. And you can go get these, they're online. Expanding these kinds of methods to better take advantage of all the available materials is not that simple. Historical materials in the about BC interior rangelands can be found all over the place. You'll find them in formal archival collections like the BC Museum in Victoria or the Vernon Archives where I live. You'll find them in digital archives like the BC Regional Digitized History Project. You'll find them in semi-accessible government agency archives and libraries, private business records, and people's garages all over the place. And I'm sure the list goes on and on. Anywhere you can imagine it, you'll find historical things left by people that cared about these landscapes enough to record something about them. The types of documents are diverse, right, and materials. They include bureaucratic materials, business operations records, diaries, logs, newspapers, scrapbooks, albums, letters, research notes, films, tapes, probably ad infinitum, right? Very little of this contains a uniform data set of the kind that Ted Lee used. However, they do contain all kinds of fragments of insights that might be useful potentially to a rangeland scientist, manager, or other if you could analyze them in some way. So how do you work with all that? What can you show? And will it provide insights that are useful in an evidence-based scientific framework, or perhaps a commercial framework? I've been working in collaboration on these questions for quite a while now, and I think collaboration is absolutely necessary because of the volume of work, the different kinds of expertise needed, and because rangelands are places that we value collectively, sometimes for different reasons. So we should come together to do this kind of work, I think, and take advantage of our different perspectives. What I want to do right now is share the results of a sort of first phase or phases of this work in California, in which my co-authors and I tried to test ecological models of change using mixed archival records. And then I want to transition to talking about my plan to launch a new phase or phases of research in British Columbia. Okay, and I must confess, my monitor became unplugged, and so I've lost my own slides. So give me a second. I think I've got it back together. 1 second. Let's go back to our slideshow. Come on, there we go. Here we are. My co-authors and I, that's Kevin Brown, Pete Alagona, and I, identified the prevailing conceptual models used to understand ecological and especially vegetation change on coastal hardwood rangelands in California. And because they're change over time models, they do, to different degrees, have predictions that you can look for in the historical record. That was our idea anyway. And this basically is what those models look like if you imagine them as historical narratives. The first is the succession and climax model. That's Frederick Clement's model that was very influential in the first half of the 20th century. And the second is the state transition model, which became very influential after 1989. And we also analyzed the cyclical replacement model, which is less known but important in California, and which you might also know as patchwork dynamics. Anyway, with our models selected, we also selected sites, and we selected 3 study sites. They were the Hastings Natural History Reservation, the Hopland Research and Extension Center, and the Sedgwick Reserve. And these 3 sites represent a sort of a latitudinal transect of this biome. They also, though, represent different management and use histories that can be fruitfully compared. And I'll point out also, each of these sites, in addition to comparing them with each other, they all have pastures, enclosures, and exclosures, and various subplots that also have differing use histories on site, and you could compare those as well. And this is an example of one from Hopland, a classic fence line photo of an area that is still heavily oak wooded, and an area that was cleared for sheep production. Most importantly, though, these 3 sites all had large, unorganized collections of records that were stored or perhaps abandoned on site. And that's on top of everything that existed in other places that were about them. And that made them good sites for us to try to do this because they had this abundance of records. And for 2 of the sites, Hastings and Sedgwick, I had worked previously on this project, the Natural Reserve System History and Archive Project, to find, index, and make those records searchable. This was a very large collaborative project, and we archived materials for about 40 sites across California. I want to highlight that because there was so much, we never actually digitized anything. You can find out a lot about these materials through this website, but you have to go there to use them. And so that's what we did. We went and we interviewed the current and past managers and researchers to understand what historical trends mattered to them and to get all kinds of leads that we could follow up as historians. We then selected our indicators of change. And our indicators of change were things that were ecologically or socially important and had sufficient records to study them historically. I want to emphasize that these indicators in the way we approach this were not necessarily dependent or independent variables. And I think that's a good approach because we could more easily account for the many things that people valued about these rangelands, and because people increasingly think of rangelands as complex, interconnected systems, and anything could be dependent or independent with anything else at a different point in time, right? Ultimately, though, we studied the absolute heck out of these sites and these indicators and began to develop long-term trends based on the method of triangulation. Triangulation is the method you use to analyze different kinds of evidence from different people collected for different reasons and pertaining to different scales of analysis. And you use that to corroborate and challenge the different things you discover, honing in on sort of a trend that is empirically supported. And this is where I think historians really come in. Historians are the archives and mixed source experts. We also, though, relied on the analytic methods of other disciplines, and displayed here is, for example, geographic information systems from historical geography. And we used this method to study vegetation change based on air photos, like Ted Lee. And I also want to emphasize, though, at this point, we avoided thinking of our data as qualitative or quantitative. Those are methods, I think. They're not data types. And I believe most data in most forms can be analyzed and expressed either way, and that's what we tried to do. We expressed our indicators through narrative environmental histories, prose-based narratives, and also through tables of data and visualizations that were drawn from those tables. And I want to show you the latter after I again see if I can bring back my slideshow. It's a good thing I speak fast because I'm able to catch up. Okay, here it is. Here is a visualization drawn from historical data. I want to emphasize these visualizations I'm showing you are unlike those ones I showed you at first. These are actually, every point on here corresponds to something, some record or some piece of evidence. We didn't, with an exception coming, but that was the goal, to really do this, but back it up. And in doing that, we've had to display things from different kind of types of analysis alongside each other so that we could put them in conversation. And you'll see in the vegetation, the solid lines, for example, are the results of our geographic information system research. And that dotted line is data that was shared with us from a pollen core sample. We also displayed data coming from different scales, and you'll see this in the livestock visualizations. We had remarkably good site level data for the period 1800 to 1850, and then it sort of disappeared until World War II, and then we had data again. So I also went and compiled county level data from old agricultural census reports. And what we found, in this, I think, an interesting thing, none of these sites, looking at their livestock trends, actually matched up with the trends in their region. And that was something a manager could use and find useful, is to recognize, actually, these are historically unique sites, all three of these. And you ought not to think of them as having the same use histories as their neighbors, actually. We also found it useful in some cases to display the hypothetical curve that existed either in the literature or in kind of a general consensus of experts, but for which there was not empirical evidence. And you see that in my ungulates graphs there. The long dotted line shows the general consensus of what people think happened with deer and boar. And we found evidence to support parts of those curves. But it also became an opportunity, as in this case with carnivores, to emphasize areas in which there was not evidence. And for example, most people in California who work with this kind of stuff think there was a long-term decline in mountain lions across the 19th century, right? We found no evidence at any scale of analysis, not our sites, not at the state of California, to support the first half of that curve, right? But nonetheless, we did find evidence to support the second half of that curve. And that's an area for future research and something that this method, I think, draws out. Looking at the precipitation graphs there, I just want to emphasize here is an example of plotting that data that people think is quantitative or qualitative together, because actually you can do it both ways. There's numerical interannual historical modeling data displayed against your more qualitative expressions of there is a drought, there is a flood. And we found that fruitful as well. Okay. And finally here, erosion and land management. Land management, interestingly, was the best predictor of a change in other indicators, but it didn't actually predict what that change would look like. It just seemed to be the case that when there was a major 10-year regime change, other things changed, but there's you couldn't say consistently what that would look like. Anyway, this took us a little bit, this took us a little bit away from our initial attempt to study these models because we incorporated so many more indicators than they had variables. But nonetheless, we found this method did enable us to assess those models and say something. The Clements model, succession and climax, was not particularly useful. State and transition models and cyclical replacement were both useful in some cases at certain scales of analysis and at certain times. And here on the screen, you'll see examples of subplots on each site, which seem to support the findings of the state transition model because they show plots that have failed to recover after some sort of disturbance. However, we also found by studying these historically that the things like this, what you're seeing, don't necessarily back up that model in the way that it was intended. What I'm trying to say is that this happened for reasons that are different than the people who created the state transition model had predicted. These three sites were all cleared on purpose by people, and they had nothing to do with overgrazing or fire, which are the types of disturbance most quoted in that literature. Let's see. I think this is a good example, just to highlight, of why we need to study people if we're going to study rangelands. Okay, I'm now at this stage in my research agenda trying to get ready to launch a new, larger phase of this research in British Columbia. I think the California research was very successful, but we selected sites that were owned by the university that we all worked for when the project started, and that university partially funded the research. I think we proved something conceptually there, but if this effort is to matter, I think it's really got to be applied more to working landscapes and to landscapes under lots of different ownership tenures. And British Columbia is a great place to do that. British Columbia has an absolute wealth of historical materials about BC interior rangelands. They're scattered all over the province and elsewhere. I'd love to talk about this to death, but very quickly, that's a map of range plants from 1918. I think it's the oldest such effort for the province, although I'd love to hear if I'm wrong. And that's just a little photograph of a map on a wall, and that photograph is now inside a photo album in the archives at UBC Vancouver. Herbarium records, another good example of a type of historical data that we could begin to think about working with in creative ways. Most importantly, though, I want to say British Columbia is a place where sustainable ranching and conservation working landscapes seem to loom large. This map shows an absolutely tiny fraction of properties that self-describe themselves as sustainable, and this is drawn from publicly available information online. My work since I made that map has suggested that we could cover this thing in dots and find lots of people who already care about rangeland sustainability and conservation, and I think potentially could better use historical insights about their sites. And perhaps most importantly of all, they could better help me to understand how historians can help support conservation in practice, which is my ultimate goal. I'm now done and out of time, but I'll throw up as a coda. This is a conceptual drawing from a pitch I made to develop some infrastructure for this work. I learned from my work with an NRS History and Archive project that we just don't have the capability of digitizing these materials and making them available in the way that they would have to be for people other than myself, right? Non-professional historians to use them fruitfully, right? They should be digitally available. But doing that would have taken several more years and several more $1 million on a project that already had spent both of those, right? So this is my idea for a truck bed mounted, mobile, remote and rural digitization and archiving laboratory that would take that effort where the records are at first pass and do things that currently I don't think this capacity is available anywhere. That's not to say I expect it to get funded. It's just part of this larger effort I'm going through of trying to reimagine historical methods so that they can be more usefully applied to rangelands and other conservation and environmental issues. And with that, I should say thank you very much. I'm absolutely eager for your questions and comments. Sarah, can
Thanks,
I
Tim.
hand it back? Yeah.
Yeah, you can leave your Myrtle diagram up there if you want. It's really
Sure,
cool.
I'll leave Myrtle up.
And I forgot to mention to the audience that you can type your questions into the comment box while the presentation was ongoing. But we've got a couple questions that I can read out for you right now. So from Wendy Gardner at Thompson Rivers University, we say, maybe you'll get to this soon, but also wondering about other disturbances such as fire and the impacts from these. And then she asked if you're going to include the Lac du Bois grassland in your proposal, like in one of your locations for your proposal project.
Okay, so I heard fire, but I missed the second type of disturbance, and I also, I missed which specific region she mentioned.
So she just asked about other disturbances such as fire and the impacts from these. And then she asked if you were going to include the Lac du Bois grasslands, just in Kamloops there, for your proposal project.
Yes, actually, and I've been sort of preparing to do this research in response for 2 years, probably longer than one ought to be preparing to start work. But in that time, I've been shifting my focus slowly northward. I started with a focus on the South Okanagan, which I think is maybe, you can see in those older maps I made and things like that. But yes, I'm very interested in the Caribou, Chilcotin region and trying to blow that project up. That's answering the second part first. The first part about other disturbances, yeah, fire was really interesting. Fire was very, very interesting in this particular phase in California. We found that like for some sites, the transition to commercial ranching and then research land use meant greater fire suppression. And in fact, some of them, we found no evidence at all that there was a fire there at all in the last 100 years. And these are all, by the way, just in case you didn't know, these sites are all right next to national forests or other kind of publicly owned lands that burn a lot. But they're just immediately outside this region that actually wasn't touched by those fires for the most part. Then other sites like Hopland, fires just ramp up, and that bit of the graph becomes solid. You can't even see the break between fires because they're setting so many fires as part of their experiments. Actually, they're setting fires for their experiments, and we found that's a heavily burned landscape. And then Hopland, also speaking of fire, in 2018, immediately after the end of our period, we looked at 1800 to 2017. In 2018, the Mendocino Complex fire torched Hopland. So that's, I think that really emphasizes the importance of kind of historically unpredictable one-time events and how they can impact a landscape, and then, really differentiate between those plots. So yeah, I think fire, we found out a lot. I would say at the end of it, though, I mean, I wish I had found more, I suppose. Like, actually, there's so much more to learn about that type of disturbance. Speaking of disturbances, erosion was the hardest to study, I would say, actually. People cared about erosion enough to record it, but never in a way that we could really compare one thing against another, right? What's the difference between one soil slip and another soil slip when you're looking at these kind of diaries that mention a soil slip, for example. Anyway, thank you for that question. I thought it was very good. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tim. We have another kind of more of a comment from Mike Deedles. He used to work for the range program in the Kamloops district. He now works for TNRD, but he says that the Kamloops district in Flynn-Roar, Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, that's a mouthful, has an old wooden cabinet full of linen range inventory maps going back up to 100 years. And it's confirmed that the cabinet is still full and in the office. And I'm sure connecting with the Kamloops Range program, they can get you connected with those documents.
Well, thank you, Mike. That's exactly why I wanted to speak today. I was really hoping to get those kinds of clues. I really appreciate that. I'm writing it down.
There's also, sorry, I have laryngitis, Tim, but there's also a lot of data that was archived with the Experimental Research Station, the Ag Canada station that existed. And when they shut down, some of that went to the ministry, and others were archived within the Canadian files. But there's tons of research right back to when that station started in the Lac du Bois area and around there that would be really helpful. And there's also a lot of people here. At some point, you and I should connect.
Yeah.
There's people here that have their own data. Bert Brink did a whole bunch of research out here. There's some people in the Naturalist Club that have pictures and stuff that they have documented over time that might be helpful. We've lost a few really important range resource people recently, but there's a lot of people have their own kind of personal photographic libraries and material that I would love to put you in touch with, because I would hate to see it just end up in a closet somewhere. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that station has been on one that I've been kind of tracking things down, and I'd love to get that help from you, Wendy, so that I can do a better job. I was terrified that those records were lost. Like when I first started, and a lot of agricultural libraries in the 2000s, right, were lost, and we know that, and that was scary to me. So I'm really glad to hear that there's bits and pieces in different places. I got some stuff from Don Gayton. Also had like his own collections, right? Those personal collections. So I absolutely rely on those, and I will take you up on that for sure.
So we've got one last question from Sean. Can you talk about how you account for people being more likely to record perceived rare events? Example, observations of predators like pumas, wolves being recorded when people think they are rare versus when people think they are commonplace. What are some strategies you use?
Yes, so this, good question, Sean, thank you. Pulling out pumas is a good example, right? Because probably we've seen those photos, those really funny photos of like family photos on vacation, and there's the mountain lion ears poking up in the background, right? And that's the thing about that animal. Most of us mostly don't know when it's nearby most of the time, right? So relying on people to make those observations and to make them consistently is immediately problematic, and that's what you're getting at. And I think it's right to remember, and I emphasize that in this work, in talking about that hypothetical puma curve, that this is a particular animal that I find the general impression of people to be somewhat unreliable. There are other ways to get around people a little bit. And an example, so not with mountain lions, but with grizzly bears, they were trying to figure out, okay, more about the grizzly bear population before it went extinct in the Sierra Nevada. And they went and found all the not records, the artifacts that had been sent all over the world, right? British Museum, places like that, all those bits of bear that were sent all over the world. And then, once they collected those and got the hair sample, they could find more about abundance, about the diet, things like that. Still working with something that was preserved by people, but almost working around their own ability to, or lack of ability to understand that animal and to sort of, work with and against traces. You asked the better question though, like what are the tips for dealing with that? I think, I mean, you pull up predators. Predators probably, or not predators is a somewhat loaded term, but you know what I'm saying. Those are some of the harder ones, and I guess this calling them predators or carnivores or omnivores, right? These are all ultimately judgments people make about them. It works in some ways, it doesn't. I guess maybe what I'd say is it's still easier to study those ones than to study gophers or grasshoppers, which is strange, these important things. And in BC had these huge grasshopper swarms, right? And yet people seem not to have spent time writing about insects and rodents. Like that's one of those, this is one area in which the method fails. If people really just did not care enough to record anything, and one wonders why they didn't, but then that's a limit to the method. And that's why ultimately, I suppose, I think of this as operating alongside and supporting the excellent methods that we already have, field research and experimental research and things that we do. Tips, ultimately, always dig a little bit deeper. I found that with this project, I was about ready to cut erosion right out of the thing, right? We almost cut fires out, right? Initially, we were having so much trouble making sense of the information on fires, and in erosion, we thought we can't do this. But as we dug deeper and dug deeper, we found that the pieces of evidence that allowed us to start triangulating and making sense of the evidence that we thought we couldn't make sense of at first. So I don't know if that's a super satisfying answer, Sean, but you sort of put your finger on the challenge, I guess.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, really good presentation today. It's really interesting. And if you need to get in contact with any of the district offices to get archive data, I can help you with that.
I would love to take you up on that. Thank
you. And so that's all we've got today. Sean says, thanks for the answer. And we're a bit over time today, but that's all right. So this recording will be available for any attendees that want to review or couldn't make it. That'll be on our YouTube channel, and a reminder that our next webinar will be on the 27th at 7 p.m. I can't remember who's presenting off the top of my head, but I'll share that info in the upcoming invite. So thank you for attending today, and everyone have a great day, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.